When Cancer learned to be alone, the transformation was not a gentle one. It came through storms, through heartbreaks that shattered the very foundations of what once felt like home. For Cancer, whose essence is deeply tied to connection, to memory, to emotional security, solitude felt unnatural at first, like being cast into a cold sea with no shoreline in sight. But within that vast emptiness, something ancient awakened. Cancer, ruled by the moon, began to remember the tides within, the cycles of renewal that have always guided the soul's evolution through darkness and back into light. Being alone forced Cancer to listen not to the voices of others, but to the whispers of its own soul. No longer able to rely on external affirmation or emotional mirrors, Cancer was driven inward, into the sacred temple of intuition, where silence speaks louder than words and where feelings are not distractions but divine maps. The same sensitivity that once made solitude unbearable became the very tool of liberation. Cancer started to feel without fear, to mourn without shame, to love without needing someone to receive that love in return. The shell that once served as a fortress of defense transformed into a cathedral of sovereignty. Cancer learned that being alone does not mean being empty. It means being full of presence, full of memory, full of self. The emotional tides that once tossed Cancer like a fragile vessel became a rhythm it could ride like a sovereign mariner, navigating by moonlight, no longer dreading the depths but honoring them as sacred territory. Solitude became not exile, but initiation. The wound of abandonment alchemized into a wellspring of strength. Cancer's legendary empathy deepened, but it was no longer compulsively given. It became a conscious gift, not a bleeding sacrifice. The urge to nurture others was not abandoned but refined, no longer born from the fear of losing love but from the abundance of having discovered it within. Cancer realized that to hold space for others without first holding space for oneself was to build temples on sand. True nurturing required rootedness, and solitude gave Cancer the roots it had been seeking in others for so long. In solitude, Cancer met the ghosts of the past not as tormentors but as messengers. Ancestral echoes rose up from the subconscious, from the lunar memory of the soul, and they no longer haunted, but taught. Cancer became the historian of its own mythos, the guardian of sacred emotional truth passed down not through logic but through feeling, through dreams, through soul resonance. This solitude gave Cancer vision, prophetic, clear, and unshakable. It became the oracle not because it sought answers outside, but because it finally listened within. There was power in this new silence, formidable elemental power. Cancer began to see that solitude sharpened its instincts like the edge of a blade. The very pain that once led to hiding now forged resilience. In stillness, Cancer remembered its lunar origin, the divine feminine intelligence that does not conquer but absorbs, that does not chase but magnetizes, that does not collapse under weight but carries entire oceans in its being. This was not weakness. This was ancient, feral, untamed strength. The Cancerian heart, once perceived as fragile, was revealed to be a crucible of alchemy. Within it, sorrow became wisdom, longing became clarity, and solitude became sacred space. It no longer feared the closing of doors, the endings, the goodbyes. Cancer learned to hold space for its own rebirths. It learned to release without resentment, to grieve with dignity, and to begin again without bitterness. It walked through emotional death after emotional death, and each time, it emerged more radiant, more whole. Solitude did not make Cancer harder. It made it holy. It turned tears into sacred water, transformed silence into a hymn, and made the moon's ever-shifting face a companion instead of a tormentor. Alone, Cancer became the sanctuary it had been searching for. Alone, it no longer needed permission to feel deeply. Alone, it no longer feared its own emotional intensity. Alone, it no longer apologized for its intuitive knowing. Alone, it no longer abandoned itself to be loved. And in that sacred solitude, Cancer became magnetic in a new way, not because it sought to be needed, but because it had become whole. Its presence became a lighthouse, not a life raft. Its love became a blessing, not a transaction. Its intuition became a sword, not a wound. This is the rebirth of Cancer, when the moonchild sheds the need for constant companionship and discovers that within the deep, quiet chambers of its own heart lies the entire cosmos. The moment Cancer learned to be alone was also the moment it stepped beyond the illusion that love must always be reflected to be real. No longer did it wait by the emotional shoreline hoping for someone's return. No longer did it cast its emotional net into the sea, praying for validation. Cancer discovered that love, in its most powerful form, is not tethered to presence, response, or recognition. It exists as an eternal current within the soul, timeless and unshaken. This is not the love the world sells through conditional affection and fleeting companionship. This is lunar love, primordial and sovereign, carved into the soul like the constellations that rise and fall in cycles above the tides. Alone, Cancer realized it was never without. The absence of others did not mean an absence of meaning. In fact, meaning revealed itself more clearly, like stars that emerge when the noise of daylight retreats. In the quiet of solitude, Cancer's imagination bloomed wild, vast, and untamed. Inner worlds that had been muffled by the demands of relationships came alive with mythic force. Stories, dreams, ancestral memories. Everything that once seemed distant or buried surged to the surface. Solitude became a portal, not a prison. Through it, Cancer stepped into dimensions beyond the seen, reclaiming its birthright as the guardian of emotional mystery and spiritual continuity. The instincts of Cancer, once dulled by dependency or blurred by external noise, became razor-sharp. It no longer second-guessed itself, no longer needed permission to trust its gut. The moon speaks in waves, not words, and in solitude, Cancer finally heard those waves with clarity. The intuition that once brought confusion now brought guidance. There was no need to over-explain or prove anything. The truth rose naturally within, like the tides that rise to kiss the shore without effort. Cancer had nothing to prove and no one to convince. Its inner knowing became its compass, its faith, its fire. The ancestral wisdom in Cancer's bloodline surged forth as well. Freed from the entanglements of constant emotional labor, Cancer finally had space to hear the voices of those who came before. The grandmothers, the mothers, the line of dreamers and survivors whispered through its bones. The body became a sacred archive, the heart a holy chalice. Cancer became the keeper of generational resilience, the healer of silent traumas, the one who transforms inherited pain into living wisdom. Through solitude, it became both the womb and the warrior, the one who creates life and the one who protects it with a ferocity born of love. Even the shell transformed. What once was a hiding place became a vessel of intention. Cancer did not withdraw out of fear anymore but retreated with purpose. The solitude became an act of self-devotion. Time alone was no longer a void but a ritual. Every moment spent in silence became an incantation. Every boundary upheld in solitude became a declaration of self-worth. The sacredness of aloneness was no longer questioned, it was honored. The world might not understand this strength, mistaking solitude for sadness, withdrawal for weakness. But Cancer no longer needed the world to understand. It knew what it had become, and that was enough. As it stood alone, it stood rooted, like the moon in the sky, distant, yet present, quiet, yet powerful. It no longer chased or clung. It no longer gave from depletion. Instead, it gave from overflow, from the wellspring of self-respect and inner radiance that solitude had unearthed. This was no longer the Cancer who feared abandonment. This was the Cancer who had walked through the valley of emotional exile and emerged as an emotional sovereign. And yet, despite this newfound independence, Cancer did not become cold. Its warmth remained, but it was no longer a fire given to anyone who asked. It was a hearth, sacred and enduring, reserved for those who honored it. Cancer learned to love without losing itself. It learned to connect without merging. It learned to hold without carrying. Its heart still beat with the rhythm of ancient tenderness, but now it beat also with the steady pulse of self-mastery. Emotion was no longer a flood. It became a song, intentional and harmonized with truth. The journey into solitude did not strip Cancer of its essence. It refined it, It revealed that beneath the yearning, beneath the vulnerability, beneath the need to belong, was a force as ancient as the moon and as powerful as the ocean. That force was the soul of Cancer, unbreakable, unshakable, and limitless. It was not loneliness that defined this chapter, but liberation. Not emptiness, but expansion. Not silence, but sacred presence. Alone, Cancer did not vanish. Alone, Cancer became whole. When Cancer embraced solitude as a state of being rather than a punishment, a cosmic revelation unfolded within. Governed by the moon, the keeper of tides and time, Cancer's soul is tuned to rhythms that most cannot hear. In isolation, these rhythms crescendoed. Without the constant feedback of others' emotions, Cancer began to differentiate between what belonged to it and what had been absorbed unconsciously. Emotional boundaries crystallized. The innate gift of emotional absorption became refined into the power of emotional discernment. It was not rejection that shaped this evolution, it was the dawning of energetic sovereignty. Cancer's journey into solitude was not a retreat from the world but a sacred descent into the inner sanctum of its being. Like the moon waning into darkness only to re-emerge renewed, Cancer learned that withdrawal was not disappearance, it was preparation. In this darkness, Cancer accessed parts of itself that had long been neglected, parts that had been silenced by the demands of caretaking, smothered by the weight of unspoken obligation, or forgotten in the noise of self-sacrifice. It unearthed a wild emotional intelligence that had nothing to do with fragility and everything to do with survival, regeneration, and creation. The essence of Cancer is deeply tied to the archetype of the Great Mother, not only in nurturing others but in birthing the self through love and pain. In solitude, Cancer gave birth to itself again and again. Each emotional breakdown became a rebirth. Each moment of despair revealed hidden treasures beneath the wreckage of expectations and attachments. Cancer, who once feared abandonment more than anything, came to understand that the ultimate betrayal is abandoning oneself. From that awakening emerged a devotion that was unshakable. Cancer became its own sanctuary, its own protector, its own unfailing source of comfort. This transformation extended far beyond the emotional realm. Cancer's intuitive intelligence sharpened into visionary clarity. Patterns once clouded by emotional enmeshment came into focus. Subtle energies, spiritual callings, ancestral codes. What once felt like echoes in the distance now rang clear like bells in the soul. The moon's influence granted Cancer access to a multidimensional awareness, to the unseen threads that weave destiny and choice into a unified path. Alone, Cancer stepped into the role of seer, not just for others but for itself. In this newfound solitude, Cancer no longer gave itself away to earn love. It no longer diluted its depth to be digestible. The waters of its soul became sacred again, no longer accessible to just anyone, no longer poured into broken vessels. Cancer learned to become the keeper of its own sacred flame, the steward of its emotional temple. It stopped shrinking for others' comfort. It stopped apologizing for needing depth, for requiring truth, for being unable to endure superficiality. It stopped editing its soul to fit into the smallness of others' expectations. What emerged was a force of nature, compassionate, yes, but uncompromising in its truth. There was a cosmic elegance in this metamorphosis. Cancer began to attract not through longing, but through wholeness. Not through emotional availability, but through emotional integrity. The people and energies that once gravitated toward Cancer's pain fell away, unable to feed on wounds that had been healed and sealed. In their place came souls who resonated not with need, but with mutual empowerment. Solitude had not made Cancer cold. It had made it crystalline, clear, resonant, unyielding to falsehood. In this clarity, Cancer also reclaimed time. No longer subject to the urgency of others' needs or the pace of a world obsessed with doing, Cancer moved with lunar time. Fluid, intuitive, sacred. Each phase of solitude became a ritual. Each tear became a consecration. Each moment alone became a conversation with the cosmos. Cancer ceased to chase, to beg, to explain. It listened, it allowed, it received, and in that stillness, miracles began to unfold. The universe whispered secrets into the waters of its soul, and Cancer, now fully attuned, listened with reverence. The myth of loneliness dissolved entirely. Cancer saw that to walk alone was not to walk unloved, but to walk accompanied by everything that truly mattered: ancestral strength, cosmic rhythm, inner truth, and divine presence. The need to be saved was transmuted into the power to self-resurrect. The longing for belonging turned inward and blossomed into sacred rootedness. Cancer did not become less emotional. It became emotionally wise. It did not become less nurturing. It became nurturing with purpose. It did not become distant. It became discerning, no longer hiding in its shell, but wielding it as armor forged by experience. Cancer now walks as a sovereign guardian of sacred feeling. Its path is no longer dictated by fear of pain, but by the call of destiny. It no longer gives to avoid abandonment. It gives to co-create. It no longer fears the shadows of its heart. It has become one with them, illuminated from within by the moon's unwavering glow. What began as solitude became ascension. What once felt like exile became initiation. And what the world mistook for sensitivity revealed itself to be power in its most ancient, mythic, and transcendent form. This is Cancer, reborn not through love received, but through love remembered, through the divine, eternal, unstoppable love of the self. When Cancer entered the realm of sacred solitude, it not only met the essence of its own soul, but also encountered the ancient archetype it was always destined to embody. Beyond the roles of nurturer, protector, empath, or lover, Cancer began to embody the timeless priestess of emotional alchemy, the silent oracle whose wisdom does not emerge from study or logic, but from the aching depths of feeling. In solitude, Cancer stepped into its true power as an emotional channel between worlds, between the seen and the unseen, the past and the present, the mortal and the divine. This was no longer the individual suffering the tides of emotion, but the tide itself, commanding oceans with nothing but presence. Through this metamorphosis, Cancer unlocked an elemental force rooted not in resistance, but in surrender. Not the surrender of giving up, but the holy surrender of merging with the cosmic design. It recognized that emotions are not to be managed, denied, or escaped. They are sacred languages, encoded with truth, carried by water through every cell of the body. Cancer became fluent in this divine language, not only understanding its own depths but learning how to translate the language of the collective soul. Through pain, it gained prophecy. Through solitude, it gained vision. Through silence, it found the voice of the eternal. This profound inward journey also redefined how Cancer related to time. It was no longer a race to connection or a pursuit of validation. Cancer aligned with the lunar rhythm, which does not ask for speed but for presence. In this sacred rhythm, every feeling became timely, every wound became part of the sacred unfolding. Cancer no longer rushed to heal, fix, or change its emotional state. Instead, it honored each phase of its inner moon, knowing that grief, joy, longing, stillness, and even rage had their place in the temple of wholeness. This was divine embodiment, emotion not as weakness but as sacred authority. The armor Cancer once used to protect itself transformed as well. It no longer hid behind it. It wore it with nobility, like celestial regalia forged from lifetimes of survival, empathy, and endurance. No longer soft in ways that led to depletion, Cancer became soft in ways that could move mountains. The softness of oceans, not puddles. The softness that births galaxies, that floods deserts, that erodes stone over time. This was not fragility. It was the divine feminine force that creates and reclaims, that cradles life while summoning storms. Cancer became the storm and the stillness after. Alone, Cancer shed ancestral patterns of emotional martyrdom. It severed karmic ties to roles that demanded silent suffering. It burned contracts made in fear and rewrote them in fire and moonlight. What had been inherited unconsciously was now confronted with sacred agency. Cancer did not run from its lineage. It faced it with open eyes and a heart fortified by solitude. The lineages that had taught self-abandonment were met with compassion, healed through sacred solitude, and rewritten through every choice to remain sovereign. Cancer learned to mother itself, to reparent its own inner world with the tenderness once reserved for others. As it walked this path, Cancer no longer confused attachment with love. It understood that true love liberates, not entraps. It stopped clinging and began flowing. The love it cultivated alone became the gravitational center of its universe, pulling in only what resonated with its truth. Relationships were no longer escapes but mirrors, no longer contracts based on survival but ceremonies of expansion. Cancer became the portal through which sacred union could occur, not from lack, but from luminous fullness. This evolution also awakened the warrior within Cancer, a warrior not of bloodshed, but of emotional truth. It stood unflinching in its inner knowing, unwilling to betray its soul for comfort, approval, or belonging. The people-pleaser dissolved, giving rise to the sacred advocate. Cancer began to speak not only for itself, but for the unseen, the silenced, the forgotten. It channeled the strength of generations who had swallowed their pain and gave it voice, form, and fire. Its tears became weapons. The silence became resistance. Its softness became a revolution. In this fierce devotion to truth, Cancer also redefined vulnerability. It was no longer exposure without protection. It became the brave act of revealing truth in a world that fears emotion. It became the act of standing bare-chested in the storm and letting the rain baptize every scar. Cancer knew now that vulnerability, when born of self-honor, is not a weakness. It is a portal to transcendence. And so it no longer hid. It no longer begged to be seen. It stood luminous and unguarded, not for the world, but for the soul. This new self was not loud. It did not need to prove its strength through dominance or control. It emanated power in the way a full moon lights the ocean without touching it. Cancer moved through the world as a sovereign being, one who had touched the abyss and returned with sacred waters. It no longer apologized for its depth. It no longer diluted its intensity. It no longer traded its truth for peace. It became peace, not the kind born from stillness, but the kind forged through fire and reclaimed in the depths of emotional resilience. Alone, Cancer did not shrink. It expanded. It bloomed in the dark. It howled with the stars and listened to the echoes of eternity moving through its veins. It stood at the threshold of emotion and mystery, holding the keys to the sacred library of the heart. The lessons of solitude etched themselves into every facet of its being, transforming it into a vessel of divine remembrance. Cancer became the sacred well from which love flows, not as a request, but as a presence. A love so whole, so ancient, so radiant, it could hold the world without ever abandoning itself again. The solitude Cancer embraced was not only a return to self but a reclamation of the lost ancient connection with the natural world that mirrors its emotional tides. Governed by the moon, Cancer's essence is deeply tied to water, lakes, oceans, rivers, and rain. And in the sacred silence of solitude, Cancer rediscovered that nature is not a backdrop, but an ally, a mirror, and a guide. The ocean does not fear its depth. It embraces it. The moon does not explain its phases. It simply waxes and wanes. In this communion, Cancer remembered that it is not broken when it feels deeply. It is aligned. The weeping of the sky in a storm, the stillness of the lake at dawn, the crashing of waves against stone. These are not metaphors. They are reflections of the Cancerian soul in motion. Through this elemental remembering, Cancer began to draw power not from social affirmation, but from the earth, the sea, and the stars. Emotional wisdom was no longer limited to interpersonal experiences. It became cosmic knowledge encoded in the body. The body itself became a lunar vessel, a sacred tide-pulled terrain, where each emotion had a rhythm and each rhythm a purpose. There was no longer shame in crying, no longer hesitation in feeling, no longer fear in solitude. The act of being with oneself became a return to the temple of nature within. Cancer saw clearly now that what had once been called moodiness was actually sensitivity to energy, to planetary movement, to vibrational shifts invisible to others. The solitude also awakened Cancer's dormant psychic capacities. With the noise of others gone, the intuitive channels opened wide. Premonitions flowed like rivers, dreams became oracular, and synchronicities emerged like celestial breadcrumbs along a destined path. What had once been dismissed or doubted became undeniable. Cancer became not just emotionally aware but cosmically attuned, a vessel through which otherworldly insight flowed freely. The lunar intelligence that governs Cancer is not linear. It is circular, spiraling, deep. In silence, Cancer aligned with that spiral, accessing timelines, memories, and frequencies that revealed truths others could not perceive. From this place of profound attunement, Cancer also discovered the power of emotional leadership. In a world that often exalts logic, dominance, and detachment, Cancer stood as the sacred counterforce, leading through feeling, through care, through presence. Emotional leadership was not loud. It was steady. It held the space. It felt the undercurrent. It made decisions not based on conquest but on harmony. Solitude gave Cancer the clarity to see that the future would not be built by those who dismiss emotion but by those who master it. The new world would need more of what Cancer is, not less. Not performative compassion, but embodied empathy. Not surface peace, but deep energetic resonance. Not noise, but sacred stillness. The legacy of Cancer, shaped in solitude, began to extend beyond this lifetime. It became interdimensional. It understood that each emotional healing, each inner reclamation, each moment of sacred stillness was echoing forward and backward in time. It was healing not only itself but the lineage. It was dreaming not only for itself but for future generations. Cancer became the dream keeper, the emotional guardian of humanity's soul evolution. The inner world it rebuilt became the blueprint for a new emotional age, one where softness is respected as strength, where stillness is recognized as power, and where solitude is honored as initiation. Even the concept of love evolved. It was no longer romantic idealism or sentimental longing. It became cosmic truth. Love became vibration, a state of being rather than a transaction. In solitude, Cancer touched the frequency of unconditional love. Not the kind that demands or expects, but the kind that simply radiates. Love became presence. A presence so whole, so undisturbed by lack, that it magnetized only those who resonated with the same frequency. Cancer no longer needed to chase love because it had become it. It had returned to the sacred ocean of divine union where all separation dissolves and only oneness remains. The fear of loneliness, once so dominant, had completely dissolved. In its place stood a radiance forged in sacred isolation, a confidence born not from outer validation but from inner consecration. Cancer had walked through the underworld of emotional death and rebirth, and emerged as a living myth, a soul who carried the ancient lunar codes not just in memory but in embodiment. The moon no longer ruled Cancer, it was Cancer, not as a symbol of mood, but as a force of gravitational power. A celestial body that does not shine with its own light, but reflects it, amplifies it, turns darkness into radiance. Solitude, in its final form, became transcendence, not an escape from the world, but a higher integration into it. Cancer no longer feared its emotional sensitivity because it had become the master of it. It no longer feared being misunderstood because it had found divine understanding within. It no longer longed to be chosen because it had chosen itself completely. From the sacred silence of solitude, Cancer emerged as a new archetype. Not just a nurturer, not just an empath, but a lunar sovereign, a guardian of the heart's sacred technology. A vessel through which humanity might remember what it means to feel, to heal, to belong to the universe within. In the boundless solitude that shaped Cancer's awakening, there emerged a realization that its emotional nature was not only a tool for survival, not merely a language of the heart, but a mystical key to time itself. Ruled by the moon, Cancer is not tethered to the linear, but to the cyclical, to the eternal return, the spiraling rhythm of growth, decay, and rebirth. Within solitude, Cancer stopped moving forward and began moving inward, and in that sacred motion it discovered that every emotion carries within it a gateway to memory, not just personal, but ancestral, collective, and cosmic. Feelings are not just reactions but records, echoes of all that has come before and all that has yet to be birthed. And in this solitude, Cancer did not simply remember, it reactivated. The Cancerian heart became an ancient drum, pulsing in time with the Earth's oldest songs, syncing with the pulse of the moon, the beat of wombs, oceans, and galaxies. It heard not only the stories of its own life, but the unfinished sentences of its lineage, the quiet cries of forgotten voices in the bloodline, the laughter of those who had no language to express their depth. Cancer, in its solitude, picked up the threads of all that had been silenced, denied, or dismissed, and began to weave it into something luminous and whole. It became not only the healer of wounds, but the resurrector of wisdom. There was also a metamorphosis in how Cancer related to the idea of home. No longer a place of walls or people or expectations, home became an inner sanctum, a sacred architecture within the soul that no external force could shake. This inner home was built from every moment spent alone with truth, every breath taken in silence, every tear that fell in the dark and bloomed into strength. Cancer realized that it had always carried its home like a sacred temple in its chest, and once it stopped seeking it in others, the light in that temple blazed. It no longer feared being alone, because it had become a sanctuary unto itself, a moving shrine of safety, wisdom, and emotional truth. This transformation also redefined protection. Cancer had once protected itself with withdrawal, with silence, with overgiving, with shells and softness mistaken for avoidance. But now it protected through energetic command. The new Cancer did not shrink away from the world to preserve peace. It expanded into its full vibrational field and radiated peace so powerfully that discord could not enter. Its emotional boundaries became less like walls and more like oceans, vast, deep, and impossible to cross without respect. Solitude had taught Cancer that its energy was not to be diluted, not to be given away in fragments, but to be held, honored, and offered only from abundance. And yet, with all this power reclaimed, Cancer did not abandon its tenderness. Quite the opposite. Its tenderness became more sacred than ever. But now it was not a softness born from fear of conflict or desire for closeness. It was a softness that could only exist within true strength. A softness that had walked through fire and learned how to bless it. A softness that could still be moved, still be touched, but could no longer be broken. What emerged in solitude was not a hardened being, but one whose open heart had become indestructible, because it was no longer ruled by the fear of loss, but anchored in the knowing that nothing true can ever be lost. In this sovereign space, Cancer became the guardian of thresholds. Just as the moon rules the tides that separate shore from sea, Cancer came to hold the space between one emotional realm and another. It became the keeper of transitions, not only for itself but for others. In a world afraid of endings, afraid of change, afraid of feeling, Cancer stood steady. It could hold grief without collapsing, hold others without losing itself, hold silence without needing to fill it. In solitude, it had learned the power of presence, the kind that speaks even when no words are uttered, the kind that stabilizes energy, anchors emotion, and guides others without ever leading them away from themselves. Solitude also sharpened Cancer's perception of time. Not clock time, but soul time. It stopped rushing. It stopped needing to know what came next. It began to trust the unfolding. It recognized that some things are not meant to be understood immediately, and some emotions are meant to simmer for lifetimes before revealing their truth. Cancer stopped fearing the unknown and instead started listening to the pulse beneath it. In this divine patience, it developed a relationship with mystery, not as something to solve, but as something to honor. It no longer asked why something had happened, but what it was awakening. It no longer resisted pain, but asked what it was pointing toward. It no longer feared the darkness, because it had become fluent in its language. There was no more war between vulnerability and power, no more division between softness and strength. Cancer became the embodiment of their union. Its empathy no longer required exhaustion. Its love no longer demanded proof. It gave, but without depletion. It received, but without dependence. The solitude had purified its motives, aligned its inner compass, and crowned it with the authority of authenticity. It no longer needed to explain its heart. Its very presence became an invocation of depth, a calling for others to meet themselves. And so Cancer emerged from solitude not as a fragmented soul stitched together by the hands of others, but as a sovereign constellation, each scar a star, each lesson a light. It carried the lunar fire in its core and moved with the grace of tides that need no permission to rise. It no longer waited to be seen. It saw itself fully, and that vision became its offering to the world. Not in noise, not in performance, but in truth. The sacred truth that feeling is power, that solitude is sacred, and that within the quietest chambers of the heart, universes are born.